Good evening, my friend. Wherever you are tonight, perhaps you are lying in bed with the lights dimmed low. Perhaps you are sitting quietly somewhere, letting the day slowly fade away. Before we begin, if you enjoy long, slow journeys through the quieter corners of history, you are always welcome here. You can like the video if you feel like it. You can subscribe if you want to return someday. And if you feel like sharing something small about your world tonight, tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is where you are. I always enjoy reading those. Some people listen from quiet apartments in crowded cities, others from small towns where the night becomes very still. Sometimes someone writes that they are listening from a ship or from a truck stop or from a hospital night shift. History travels strangely across the modern world, and tonight we are going to drift slowly into a place that was once very far from quiet, a place filled with horses, with muddy boots, with officers who were very tired, with soldiers who spoke so many languages that sometimes they barely understood each other, and with an army so large, so complicated, and so exhausted that one night it managed to fight a battle without ever meeting the enemy. But before that night ever arrived, there was something far more ordinary: an empire. Empires are strange things. They begin with grand ideas, borders, power, order. But when you look closely, when you move past the maps and the uniforms and the banners, an empire is really just a collection of small, improvised solutions that somehow never stopped being temporary. The Habsburg Empire was particularly good at this. If a border became dangerous, they did not redesign the entire system. They simply added another small solution, and another, until the solution itself slowly became the system. One of those solutions appeared along the southeastern edge of the empire, a long, uneasy frontier that faced the Ottoman world. The Ottomans had been powerful for centuries. They had marched deep into Europe. They had once stood outside Vienna itself. And even in the late 18th century, long after the great dramatic invasions had faded, the frontier still felt tense. Not dramatic, not heroic, just tense. The kind of tension that lingers in the background of daily life. Villages built with the understanding that soldiers might pass through. Fields farmed by men who also owned muskets. Church bells that sometimes rang not for prayer, but for warning. So the empire created something that was meant to be temporary. A military border zone, a place where settlers would live. But not just live, they would farm the land, raise families, build villages, and in exchange, they would also be soldiers. Or at least soldiers when needed. It seemed like a clever idea. Give people land. In return, they defend the frontier. No expensive standing army required. No massive garrisons. Just communities that could transform into defense. A temporary solution. Naturally, it lasted for centuries. That is the quiet way of bureaucratic improvisation. Someone creates a quick fix. The quick fix works well enough. Then everyone becomes accustomed to it. Then no one remembers that it was ever meant to be temporary. And eventually, the temporary thing becomes permanent. On this frontier lived people from many worlds. Serbs, Romanians, Croats, Hungarians, Germans, frontier soldiers, farmers, refugees, families who had fled earlier wars, families who had been settled there by imperial planners. Languages mixed constantly. Markets sounded like puzzles. Orders had to be translated. Arguments sometimes required 3 interpreters. But life continued. Cows needed milking, bread needed baking, children needed raising, and occasionally armies passed through. Armies are strange visitors in ordinary places. They arrive suddenly. Thousands of men, thousands of horses, carts, tents, barrels, flour, cooking pots, officers, servants, traders, camp followers, entire moving cities. And wherever they go, they carry a small universe of inconveniences. Water becomes scarce, firewood disappears, fields are trampled, roads turn to mud, villages fill with noise, and yet, in a strange way, this chaos becomes routine, because armies always believe they are only passing through, just a temporary inconvenience, just a few weeks, just a campaign, just until the war is over. The war, of course, never feels temporary to the people living there. But soldiers rarely think that far ahead. Soldiers think about much smaller things: bread, boots, warmth, and occasionally alcohol. Armies have always had complicated relationships with alcohol. Officers officially disapprove, but unofficially understand. A long march is easier with a little warmth in the stomach. A cold night feels less cold. Fear becomes quieter, and boredom, perhaps the most dangerous enemy of soldiers, becomes manageable, which means that wherever armies travel, alcohol quietly follows, sometimes carried in wagons, sometimes sold by traders, sometimes appearing mysteriously in villages where soldiers suddenly have coins to spend, and sometimes appearing at exactly the wrong moment. But we are not quite there yet, because before the night of confusion, before the shouting, before the rumors of enemies that were not there was an emperor, and emperors have their own problems. There are many kinds of emperors. Some remain safely inside their palaces. They read reports. They move small wooden markers across large maps. They sign orders, and the war happens somewhere far away, out of sight. Joseph II was not that kind of emperor. He had an unfortunate habit that many rulers develop when they believe strongly in efficiency. He wanted to see things himself. He wanted to inspect, to verify, to supervise, to correct mistakes personally. This sounds admirable on paper, but in the 18th century, when wars were fought in muddy valleys and swampy borders, it also meant something else. It meant that sometimes the emperor himself ended up sleeping in a tent. And tents, as it turns out, are not very imperial. They flap in the wind. They leak when it rains. They smell faintly of horses, leather, damp wool, and smoke. An emperor in a tent is still an emperor, but the tent does not particularly care. Joseph II had come south to oversee the war against the Ottoman Empire. The plan looked very reasonable on paper. The Habsburg Empire would coordinate with Russia, two great powers pressing against the Ottoman frontier. Pressure from two directions. The Ottomans would struggle to respond. Maps made this look extremely simple, but maps have a habit of hiding the worst details. They do not show insects. They do not show mud. They do not show mosquitoes large enough to ruin a night's sleep, and they certainly do not show disease. Armies in the 18th century were rarely defeated first by bullets. They were defeated by fever, by stomach sickness, by water that looked clean but was not, by air that carried something unpleasant through the camp, and by the slow exhaustion that spreads when thousands of men are sleeping poorly for weeks. Joseph's army was enormous, But enormous armies have enormous problems. Food must move constantly. Flour, salt, barrels, livestock, cooking kettles. Every meal required logistics. Every march required coordination. Every camp required water. Every horse required fodder. And the army had many horses. Cavalry horses, officer horses, messenger horses, artillery horses, draft horses pulling wagons, each one eating, each one drinking, each one producing a surprising amount of manure. An army camp is a remarkable place if you observe it quietly. Thousands of small routines unfolding at once. A soldier repairing a boot, another cleaning a musket, someone stirring a pot, someone cursing quietly because the bread ration has become smaller again, someone writing a letter home that will take months to arrive, and somewhere in the background, always, someone coughing. Joseph himself was coughing. He had a fever, a deep, persistent cough that followed him through the campaign. This was not unusual. Almost everyone in the army was sick with something. Malaria drifted through the valleys. Dysentery travelled quietly through contaminated water. Men who had marched proudly a month earlier now moved more slowly. Faces looked thinner, eyes more tired. Officers still gave confident orders. But confidence becomes difficult when the army spends half its time building latrines, which, incidentally, armies must do constantly. No one writes heroic poems about military latrines, but they are very important. Thousands of men cannot simply ignore such matters. So every new camp begins with digging, always digging, long trenches, earth piled beside them, a routine so ordinary that soldiers barely think about it anymore. Another temporary solution. Dig a trench today, move tomorrow, dig another trench. And somewhere in this endless routine, the army continued moving slowly across the frontier. Villages appeared. Villages disappeared behind them. Fields, forests, streams, occasionally a small town. The towns were always curious places when an army approached. First came rumors, then scouts, then dust on the horizon, and finally the army itself. Local people reacted in predictable ways. Some tried to sell food, some hid what food they had, some simply watched. Children stared at uniforms. Old men shook their heads slowly. Women counted the number of horses. Everyone wondered the same question. How long will they stay? Because armies always promise they are leaving soon. They always say the same thing. Just a few days. Only temporary. Only until the campaign moves forward. But armies are terrible at leaving quickly. There are always wagons to reorganize, orders to rewrite, roads to repair, bridges to build, supplies that have not arrived, supplies that arrived in the wrong place, supplies that arrived but were mysteriously empty. And of course, alcohol. Alcohol moves through an army in curious ways. It rarely appears in official reports. No officer writes in his diary, "Today the men were somewhat drunk," but the evidence is always there. Sutlers, camp traders, villagers with barrels. A bottle exchanged for a coin, another bottle exchanged for a pair of boots, and sometimes several bottles exchanged for nothing more than laughter and a headache. It was not unusual for advance patrols to wander slightly ahead of the main army. Cavalry units, light troops, men sent forward to observe roads and rivers. They often arrived first in small villages, which meant they were often the first to discover whatever goods those villages had to offer: bread, cheese, fruit, and occasionally something stronger. Meanwhile, behind them, the rest of the army continued arriving, slowly, very slowly, like a long mechanical creature made of wagons and boots and tired men. Orders shouted in German, then repeated in Hungarian, then translated again into another language. Because the Habsburg army was many things, but simple was not one of them. A German officer might command soldiers who spoke 3 different languages, sometimes 4. In daylight, this worked reasonably well. Commands could be demonstrated. Gestures helped. Routine filled the gaps. But night was different. Night removes certainty. Shapes become shadows. Voices become echoes. And when an army is already exhausted, night becomes a very dangerous place for misunderstandings, especially when rumors travel faster than orders. And rumors always travel faster than orders. Someone hears something, someone else repeats it slightly differently. A third person becomes certain, and by the time the officers arrive to correct the story has already grown legs. The army continued moving, day after day, camp after camp, and eventually they arrived near a small town, a quiet place on the frontier, a place surrounded by hills and roads and fields, a place that would soon become famous for a battle that was not really a battle at all, Karánsebes. At first, it looked ordinary. Another stop, another temporary camp, another night. But armies are strange machines. Sometimes everything appears normal, right until the moment it stops working. And on one particular evening, something very small happened first. Not a battle, not a grand mistake, just a very small human disagreement. The kind that happens in armies all the time. A bottle, a group of cavalrymen, and several very thirsty soldiers. Armies, despite their uniforms and discipline, are still made of people. And people have a remarkable ability to turn very small inconveniences into very large problems, especially when they are tired, especially when they are far from home, and especially when they believe they have discovered something valuable that they do not wish to share. On that evening near Karánsebes, the army was settling into another routine camp, tents rising slowly, fires appearing in small circles across the darkening fields, cooking kettles suspended above flames, the quiet metal sounds of spoons against tin bowls, horses snorting softly, leather creaking. Somewhere far off, a dog barking in one of the nearby villages. It was the kind of evening that soldiers remember very well, not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing dramatic seemed likely. The sky was darkening slowly. A faint orange line lingered on the horizon, and the first stars began to appear. Ahead of the main camp, however, some cavalry patrols had already moved forward. Hussars, light cavalry, fast riders, men who were accustomed to traveling ahead of the slower mass of infantry and wagons. Their job was simple: observe the roads, watch the river crossings, look for enemy movement, report anything unusual. Most of the time, these patrols found nothing, and when soldiers find nothing for several days, they begin to look for something else instead. Food, comfort, a moment of entertainment, or perhaps something to drink. Somewhere along the road, outside Karánsebes, the cavalry encountered a group of traders, travelers, local merchants, or perhaps simply opportunistic villagers. In frontier regions, These categories often blended together. The traders had brought barrels, barrels that smelled strongly of schnapps. Now, schnapps is not a complicated drink. It is clear, strong, and extremely effective at warming a soldier who has spent the entire day riding through damp autumn air. The hussars, understandably, were pleased. Coins appeared, barrels were opened, metal cups were filled. The first drink was quick, the second slower, the third accompanied by laughter, and after several days of marching, laughter feels very good. The cavalrymen sat beside the road, boots stretched toward the fire, horses tied nearby, stories exchanged. Someone exaggerated a recent patrol. Someone else claimed he had seen Ottoman scouts in the distance. Someone laughed and said the Turks were probably still far away. Another drink, another joke, another cup. The night deepened. Back in the main camp, the rest of the army continued arriving. Infantry columns marching in long lines, artillery wagons creaking, carts loaded with flour sacks, cooks preparing the evening meal, officers attempting to organize the chaos of tents and units and supply wagons. It was slow work, very slow work, because an army that large never moves gracefully. It moves like a tired animal with too many legs. Eventually, some of the infantry began drifting toward the sounds of laughter down the road. Soldiers are naturally curious creatures. Where there is laughter, there may also be food, or drink, or news, or at the very least, a distraction from boredom. When the infantry arrived, they saw the cavalrymen sitting comfortably around the barrels, cups in hand, faces already a little flushed. The smell of alcohol drifting warmly through the cool air. Now here is something interesting about human behavior. When one group of soldiers discovers alcohol, another group of soldiers almost immediately believes that the alcohol should belong to everyone. This belief is rarely written into military regulations, but it exists very strongly nonetheless. So the infantry approached, at first politely, a few smiles, a few hopeful glances at the barrels, perhaps a comment or two about how thirsty the march had been. The cavalrymen, however, had a different view. After all, they had discovered the traders. They had paid the coins. They had opened the barrels. In their minds, this was their reward. A small piece of comfort after long hours in the saddle. And comfort in war is extremely valuable. So they refused. Not aggressively, not violently, just a casual refusal, a few joking remarks, a suggestion that the infantry should go find their own traders. This is where the first tiny crack appeared, because soldiers who have marched all day do not enjoy being told to walk somewhere else, especially when the barrels are sitting directly in front of them. Voices became slightly louder, nothing dramatic, just irritation. Someone insisted again. Someone else refused again. A cup was lifted. A hand reached toward it. And then someone pushed someone else. Not a punch. Not yet. Just a shove. The sort of shove that says, "You are standing too close," which of course guarantees that the other person will now stand even closer. The cavalrymen stood. The infantry stepped forward. Several voices began speaking at once. Different accents, different languages. German, Hungarian, Serbian, perhaps Romanian. The words began overlapping, misunderstood, repeated incorrectly. This is the problem with arguments in multilingual armies. Even when people are trying to explain themselves, they sometimes fail, which means the explanation slowly becomes an accusation. Someone shouted something that sounded like an insult. Someone else responded with something louder. A barrel tipped slightly. A cup spilled, and suddenly someone fired a shot. No one was aiming. Not really. It was a warning. Or perhaps an accident. A musket discharged into the night. The sound was extremely loud. Gunshots always are, especially when the surrounding countryside is quiet. The echo rolled across the fields, into the camp, into the darkness, and the moment the sound reached the main army, something very predictable happened. Someone shouted, "The Turks!" Not because anyone had actually seen the Turks, but because that is what soldiers shout when they hear gunfire in the dark. The word moved through the camp like wind through dry grass. Turks! Turks! The Turks are attacking. No one stopped to verify. Because verification requires calm, and calm is very rare when thousands of tired soldiers are suddenly awake in the dark. Within seconds, tents opened, men stumbled outside, muskets grabbed, officers shouted orders, horses panicked, and somewhere in the confusion, someone heard the word incorrectly. Halt! An officer shouting for soldiers to stop, but in the darkness, with different languages colliding in the night air, some men heard something else. Allah. And that word, in that moment, sounded very much like the battle cry of an Ottoman army, which meant only one thing: the enemy must already be here. And if the enemy was already here, then the only reasonable response was to start shooting. Night has a way of turning small sounds into large fears. During the day, soldiers see clearly. They recognize uniforms. They recognize faces. They recognize the difference between a friendly patrol and an approaching enemy. But night removes all of those comforts. Shapes become shadows. Voices become echoes. And imagination begins to work much faster than reason. The musket shot that rang out near the road did not sound like an argument to the men in the main camp. It sounded like the beginning of a battle. And when soldiers believe a battle has begun, they behave exactly as they have been trained to behave. They reach for their weapons. They shout warnings. They attempt to form lines. Unfortunately, none of these actions work particularly well when thousands of tired men are waking up in complete darkness. Some soldiers were still inside their tents when the shouting began. Others had already fallen asleep beside dying campfires. Some had removed their boots. Others had not yet eaten, and suddenly all of them were awake at once. The first voices began shouting across the camp. Enemy, form up, take position. But those words traveled strangely through the night. Some units heard them clearly, others heard fragments, and many soldiers heard nothing except panic. The Habsburg army was not a single unified language. It was a mosaic of languages. German commands moved through the darkness first, but not everyone understood German, so officers repeated the orders in other tongues: Hungarian, Serbian, Croatian, fragments of Romanian. But translation takes time, and panic moves faster than translation. Meanwhile, near the road where the argument had begun, the situation had already grown worse. The infantry and cavalry were now fully shouting at one another. Someone fired another shot, then another, still not aimed at an enemy. Just confusion, just warning shots, just the desperate human habit of responding to noise with more noise. But to the rest of the army, those scattered shots sounded like a growing firefight. A real battle. Somewhere in the darkness, an officer attempted to restore order. He rode forward on horseback, shouting the most reasonable command available. Halt! Stop shooting! Stop moving! Stop panicking! Halt! It is a simple word, clear, short, but language can be treacherous at night. Some soldiers heard it correctly. Others heard only the sharp consonant, HLT, and somewhere in the darkness, a group of men believed they heard something else entirely. Allah. Now, the Ottoman army often shouted religious cries during battle. Many European soldiers knew this. They had heard stories. Some had heard it in previous campaigns. So when the sound Allah seemed to echo across the darkness, a terrible conclusion formed almost instantly. The Turks were already inside the camp, and if the Turks were already inside the camp, then hesitation could be fatal. So some soldiers did the only thing that seemed logical. They fired. Muskets flashed in the night. Brief bursts of orange light. Sharp explosions. Smoke drifting across the camp. Other units saw those flashes and assumed they were enemy gunfire, which meant they also fired. Lines that were meant to face outward began firing sideways. Some soldiers fired toward moving shapes. Others fired toward the flashes themselves. And every shot created more flashes, which created more targets, which created more fear. Horses began panicking. Horses always panic early in chaos. They feel tension before humans understand it. A frightened horse can pull an entire wagon sideways. Two frightened horses can overturn a cart. And once wagons begin moving in the wrong direction, an army camp becomes extremely dangerous. Artillery horses broke their lines. Supply wagons lurched forward. Flour sacks spilled into the mud. Cooking fires were knocked over. Tents collapsed. Some soldiers began running. Others tried to form ranks. Still others simply crouched beside wagons, unsure what direction the enemy might come from. The darkness did not help. In fact, the darkness made everything worse, because soldiers could not easily see the uniforms of the men they were shooting at. All they could see were shapes, movement, flashes, smoke, and fear has a way of turning shadows into enemies. Some officers rode desperately through the chaos, trying to restore order. Halt! Cease fire! Stand your ground! But those words were swallowed by noise, and by the time an officer reached one group of soldiers, another group had already begun shooting again. Meanwhile, the artillery units, those responsible for the cannons, faced a very unpleasant decision. If the enemy truly was inside the camp, then artillery might be needed immediately. But artillery does not work quietly. Cannons require preparation. Horses must be positioned. Powder must be loaded. And once fired, a cannon does not ask who stands in its path. Eventually, someone gave the order, and the first cannon fired into the darkness. The explosion rolled across the valley like thunder. That single sound changed everything, because if soldiers had previously believed that a small skirmish was happening, the cannon convinced them that a full battle had begun. More muskets fired. More horses broke loose. Men shouted in several languages at once. And somewhere in the middle of this spreading chaos, the emperor himself was still present. Joseph II, sick, exhausted, and suddenly surrounded by an army that appeared to be destroying itself. He attempted to ride forward to understand what was happening, but understanding a battle in daylight is difficult. Understanding chaos in darkness is nearly impossible. Some accounts later suggested that Joseph's horse stumbled. Others claim he nearly fell into a stream while trying to move through the panic. Whether or not that exact moment happened, one thing is certain. The emperor quickly realized something very alarming. No one knew where the enemy was. Because there was no enemy, only the echo of fear spreading through thousands of confused soldiers. And yet the shooting continued, because once panic begins in an army, it does not stop easily. It spreads, like a rumor, like a fire, or like the echo of a single gunshot that refuses to fade. And somewhere in the darkness, the soldiers who had originally been arguing over a barrel of schnapps were probably no longer arguing at all. They were likely running with everyone else, trying to survive a battle that no one had intended to start. There is a strange moment in every large panic. At first, the noise is sharp and sudden, gunshots, shouting, commands, but after a while, the panic begins to stretch. It spreads outward, and what began as a small burst of confusion becomes something slower, stranger, almost like a tide moving through the dark. That night, near Karánsebes, the Habsburg army had already crossed the point where reason could easily return. Thousands of soldiers were awake, thousands more were running, and almost no one had a clear idea of what was happening. In small groups across the camp, men were trying to interpret the sounds around them. A shot somewhere to the left, a horse screaming somewhere to the right, someone shouting in German, someone shouting in Hungarian, another voice shouting something in Serbian to an exhausted soldier standing in the dark. This mixture of languages sounded less like an organized army and more like enemies appearing everywhere at once, which of course made the fear grow larger. Some units attempted to form defensive lines, but the difficulty with forming lines in darkness is that you cannot see where the line should be. Soldiers tried to stand shoulder to shoulder, but sometimes the man beside them spoke a different language. Sometimes the officer giving orders had already ridden away. Sometimes the ground itself was uneven and full of wagons and fallen tents. And sometimes the soldier standing next to you suddenly decided that running was a better idea. Running is extremely contagious in armies. One man runs, another sees him running. The second man assumes the first man must know something, and within seconds, dozens are running, soon hundreds, because if a soldier sees other soldiers fleeing, he must choose between two unpleasant possibilities. Either those men are cowards, or those men know something he does not. And in the dark, with gunfire echoing around him, most soldiers prefer not to test which explanation is correct. So they run. That night, many soldiers ran toward the rear of the camp. Unfortunately, that was also where the supply wagons were parked. Supply wagons are peaceful things during the day. Wooden carts, canvas covers, barrels, flour sacks, cooking pots. But when frightened soldiers crash into them in the middle of the night, they become obstacles. Horses tangled in harnesses, wheels locked in mud, carts overturning, barrels rolling loose across the ground, flour spilling like pale dust into the darkness. Some soldiers tripped, others tried to climb over wagons. Someone shouted that enemy cavalry were approaching. Another soldier shouted that the Turks were already inside the baggage train, which meant the panic moved deeper into the camp. Artillery crews struggled desperately to control their horses. Artillery horses are large, powerful animals. When they panic, they do not move gently. They pull hard. Sometimes entire cannon teams broke loose. Heavy guns dragged across the earth by frightened animals. Iron wheels smashing through tents. Sparks flying where metal struck stone. Some artillerymen attempted to fire again, not because they could see an enemy, but because the sound of cannon fire might frighten the supposed attackers. Instead, the cannon frightened their own army even more, because to soldiers farther away, those explosions sounded like confirmation. The battle was now enormous. The Turks must be everywhere. Officers rode frantically through the confusion. Some attempted calm explanations. There are no Turks. Stop firing! But calm explanations rarely succeed when men believe they are about to die. Other officers abandoned explanation and simply tried to move their units away from the noise. Retreat seemed safer, but retreat requires direction, and direction was very difficult to determine in darkness. Some units marched in circles, others drifted toward the nearest road. Still others followed groups of running soldiers simply because they did not want to remain alone. Meanwhile, scattered musket fire continued across the fields. Each shot reignited fear. Each flash in the distance suggested enemy movement. And every few minutes, someone shouted the word again. Turks! The word carried enormous power. Because the Ottoman army was expected to be nearby, everyone believed a battle could happen soon, so the rumor felt reasonable. The rumor felt possible, and once a rumor feels possible, it becomes very difficult to destroy. Hours passed. Slowly, confusion stretched across the night. Some soldiers hid in ditches. Others lay flat on the ground beside abandoned wagons. Some continued firing randomly at shadows. Others simply waited, listening, trying to understand whether the enemy might appear at any moment. In the distance, the hills remained silent. The real Ottoman army, wherever it was that night, was not attacking. It was not advancing through the camp. It was not shouting war cries. It was not even aware of the extraordinary chaos unfolding in the Austrian army. But the Austrian soldiers did not know that. And uncertainty can be far more frightening than a visible enemy. Near the center of the camp, Emperor Joseph was still attempting to make sense of the disaster. Messengers arrived breathless with contradictory reports. The left wing is under attack. No, the cavalry is retreating. No, the baggage train is lost. No, the enemy is already inside the camp. Each report contradicted the previous one. Each messenger believed his version completely. Joseph listened, coughed, asked questions, received no useful answers. He had come to supervise the war personally. But this was not a battlefield he could supervise. This was confusion, and confusion does not obey imperial authority. At some point during the night, large parts of the army simply abandoned the camp, not in organized retreat, just movement away from danger, away from gunfire, away from shadows that might contain enemies. Units drifted toward nearby towns. Others scattered along roads leading north. Carts were left behind, cooking kettles abandoned, tents collapsed and forgotten. The great imperial army slowly dissolved into frightened fragments moving through the darkness. And all of it, all of this chaos, had begun with something so small: a barrel, a refusal to share, a shove, a single shot. The night stretched onward. The firing slowly decreased. Exhaustion replaced panic, and eventually, very slowly, The eastern sky began to grow pale. Morning was coming. And with morning, the army would finally see what it had been fighting all night. Morning in an army camp is usually a noisy thing. Even on peaceful days, men waking slowly, boots being pulled on, fires being restarted, the clatter of metal cups, horses snorting impatiently, someone shouting for water, someone else complaining about the bread, the ordinary sounds of 1,000 small routines beginning again. But the morning after that night near Karánsebes was not ordinary. At first, it was strangely quiet. The sky brightened slowly above the fields. A pale grey light spread across the valley. Mist lingered near the ground, and for a few moments there was almost no sound at all. Because exhaustion had finally caught the army, men who had spent hours shouting and running had collapsed wherever they could, beside wagons, in shallow ditches, near abandoned fires, some still holding their muskets, others curled against saddles or supply barrels. When the first soldiers began to wake, they did not immediately understand where they were. The night had blurred everything. Fear has a way of compressing time. What felt like a continuous battle suddenly seemed distant and unreal in the cool light of morning. One soldier sat up slowly. Another rubbed his eyes. Someone looked across the field and saw shapes in the grass. At first, the shapes seemed threatening. Then the soldier realized they were just other soldiers, sleeping or lying still. Gradually, the camp began to stir. Small groups gathered. Men spoke quietly. Some asked the same question again and again. Where are the Turks? No one had a clear answer, because the truth was becoming increasingly obvious. There were no Turks. No enemy army had attacked during the night. No Ottoman cavalry had ridden through the tents. No Janissaries had charged the camp. The hills around Karánsebes were calm, silent, empty. The battlefield that everyone believed had existed had never existed at all. And yet the damage was very real. As the light grew stronger, soldiers began to see what the night had done. Tents were torn and collapsed, supply wagons overturned, flour scattered across the ground like pale dust, cooking kettles missing, some broken, some simply gone, horses wandering loose across the fields, artillery pieces sitting awkwardly in the wrong places, some cannons half buried in mud where panicked teams had dragged them. Men were missing, not thousands as later stories would claim, but enough. Some had been wounded by musket fire, others injured by wagons or horses. Several had simply vanished during the night's retreat. Some of them would return later, embarrassed, exhausted, covered in mud from ditches or forests where they had hidden. But for the moment, no one knew where they were. Officers attempted to reassemble their units. This was not easy, because units had scattered across several miles during the panic. Messengers rode back and forth along muddy roads, trying to locate infantry companies, trying to count artillery teams, trying to find the baggage train. The baggage train, unfortunately, had suffered badly. Many wagons had been abandoned during the night. Some had been looted already by nearby villagers who had cautiously approached the deserted camp. This was another quiet habit of war. Local people often waited for chaos, because chaos meant opportunity. A wagon full of flour, a barrel of grain, a cooking pot, a saddle. Objects that soldiers considered ordinary could become extremely valuable to someone living in a small frontier village. So as the army slowly tried to rebuild itself, Some of its missing supplies were already disappearing down quiet rural roads. Meanwhile, Emperor Joseph received the morning reports. They were not encouraging. Units scattered, equipment lost, men wounded, confusion everywhere, and perhaps most humiliating of all, no enemy attack. The emperor had come south to lead a war against the Ottoman Empire, but during the night near Karánsebes, his army had fought something else entirely. It had fought rumor, fear, and its own imagination. Joseph was not a foolish man. He understood very quickly that the situation was embarrassing, not simply a small mistake, but the kind of event that spreads through armies very quickly. Soldiers talk, officers write letters, stories grow, and once a story becomes amusing, it becomes almost impossible to erase, which meant that somewhere in the army already, someone was probably laughing quietly, because if soldiers cannot laugh at absurdity, they would not survive war at all. The army spent the next hours reorganizing, units returning, horses recaptured, cannons repositioned, wagons repaired. The camp slowly returned to something resembling order. But the mood had changed. Confidence had been damaged. The army now knew something uncomfortable. In darkness, in confusion, it could turn against itself. And perhaps the strangest part of the entire story was still ahead, because the Ottoman army, the real enemy, had not yet arrived. 2 days later, they would. And when they approached Karánsebes, they would find something unexpected, a town already abandoned, a battlefield that had already happened, and an imperial army that had already defeated itself. Armies rarely enjoy being embarrassed. It is one of the quiet truths of military life. Soldiers can endure hunger, cold, long marches, even defeat, but embarrassment lingers. It follows an army long after the battle has ended. And the morning after the strange night near Karánsebes had left the Habsburg army with something very uncomfortable. A story, not yet a famous story, not yet the legend it would later become, but already something that soldiers whispered about while repairing wagons or collecting scattered equipment. Some told it as a misunderstanding, others told it as a moment of chaos, and a few, already beginning to enjoy the absurdity of it all, told it with quiet laughter. An army that had spent an entire night fighting shadows. But armies do not have much time to reflect on their mistakes, because war continues moving forward. Even when soldiers would prefer to pause, the Habsburg army began to reorganize itself slowly. Officers walked through the camp, making notes. Artillery crews inspected damaged equipment. Messengers rode out along the roads, trying to gather scattered units. Some soldiers who had fled during the night began returning, one by one, embarrassed, covered in mud, offering explanations that were not always very convincing. I thought the enemy was behind us. I was told the Turks had already broken through the line. I was following orders. Orders that no one could quite identify. The emperor himself moved through the camp quietly. Joseph II was not known for enjoying foolishness, and this situation contained a great deal of it. Still, there was little point in punishing the entire army. Fear in the darkness is a powerful force. Even disciplined soldiers can lose their clarity when rumors spread faster than commands. So the emperor focused on restoring order. Units were reassigned, supplies reorganized, artillery repositioned. The camp slowly began to resemble a functioning army again. But something subtle had changed. Confidence had cracked, not completely, but enough that many soldiers now understood something new about war. The enemy is not always the greatest danger. Sometimes the greatest danger is confusion. Days passed. The army moved again, carefully, more cautiously than before. Scouts rode farther ahead. Officers paid closer attention to night patrols. And somewhere in the background of every conversation, the memory of that strange night lingered quietly. Then a new report arrived. Ottoman forces had been sighted. This time the report was real. The Ottoman army was moving toward the region, marching along the same frontier roads that the Habsburg army had been struggling to control. Their approach was not especially dramatic. No thunder of thousands of hooves, no enormous banners visible across the hills. Just the steady movement of another army doing exactly what armies have always done. Marching, scouting, advancing cautiously. When Ottoman forces approached the area around Karánsebes, they found something unexpected. The Austrian army was not there, or rather, not fully there, because much of the imperial force had already withdrawn or scattered after the night of confusion. The camp had been abandoned, supplies left behind, defensive positions incomplete. The town itself stood strangely quiet. And so the Ottomans entered, not through a heroic assault, not through a dramatic siege, but simply by walking into a place that had already been emptied by its defenders. It was an unusual kind of victory, a victory created partly by accident, partly by rumor, partly by exhaustion, and partly by the peculiar ability of very large armies to misunderstand themselves. The Ottoman soldiers who entered Karánsebes probably had no idea what had happened there only days earlier. They saw abandoned wagons, scattered equipment, perhaps a few damaged tents, signs that an army had been present, and signs that the army had left quickly, which, in war, usually suggests defeat. But the truth was stranger than defeat. The Battle of Karánsebes, if one chooses to call it a battle, had been fought entirely by one side. And yet the story did not end there, because soldiers carry stories with them. They tell them while marching. They repeat them while cooking. They exaggerate them while drinking. And the longer a story travels, the more colorful it becomes. Soon, someone added a detail, then another. Soon the argument over alcohol became the beginning of the entire disaster. Soon the number of wounded grew larger. Soon someone claimed thousands had died. Soon the emperor himself was said to have fallen from his horse into a stream while fleeing the chaos. Each telling became slightly more dramatic, slightly more absurd, and far more entertaining. Because history has a peculiar relationship with embarrassment. If a mistake is small, it disappears. If a mistake is enormous, it becomes unforgettable. And the night near Karánsebes had been enormous enough that no one would forget it. Not the soldiers, not the officers, and, eventually, not historians either. But what made the story endure was not the number of casualties, or the military consequences. It was something much more human, a reminder that even the largest armies in Europe, armies commanded by emperors, armies equipped with cannons and cavalry and discipline, were still made of tired men, men who argued, men who misunderstood each other, men who fired muskets into the dark when fear became louder than reason. And sometimes that was enough to create an entire battle, even when no enemy was present. Armies move on. That is their nature, even after strange nights, even after embarrassing mistakes, even after battles that no one quite understands. They gather their equipment, reform their lines, count their horses, and begin marching again. The Habsburg army did exactly that. Slowly, carefully, the columns reassembled themselves along the muddy frontier roads. Infantry first, then artillery, then the endless line of wagons that always followed an 18th century army. From a distance, it probably looked impressive again. Uniforms in order, standards lifted above the ranks, cannons rolling steadily, officers riding ahead with the confidence expected of them. But inside the army, something quieter had changed. Soldiers remember things, especially things that happen at night, because night has a way of magnifying embarrassment. And so the story of Karánsebes travelled with them, not officially, not written in orders, but whispered between fires, repeated during long marches, sometimes exaggerated slightly, sometimes told with dry humour. A soldier stirring a pot might say, "Careful with that musket tonight. We might defeat ourselves again." Another soldier might laugh and reply, "At least the Turks did not have to work very hard." It was the kind of humour soldiers often develop, quiet, a little dark, but useful, because laughter can soften memories that would otherwise feel uncomfortable. And armies need that. War contains too many uncomfortable memories already. The officers, of course, preferred not to discuss the event very much. Officers tend to believe that discipline solves everything, and perhaps in daylight, with perfect visibility, with fresh soldiers, with clear commands, discipline might solve everything. But night has always been the enemy of discipline. Night removes certainty. Night amplifies rumor. Night allows imagination to fill every empty space. Which is why armies throughout history have struggled with the same problem again and again. How do you control thousands of frightened men in darkness? The answer, unfortunately, is that you rarely can. The problem did not begin at Karánsebes, and it certainly did not end there. Centuries before that night, Roman legions had sometimes attacked their own allies during night maneuvers. In medieval wars, soldiers occasionally fled their own camps after hearing false alarms. Even in much later centuries, modern armies with radios and electric lights have experienced moments of friendly fire and confused panic. Large groups of humans, especially armed humans, are never as orderly as the diagrams in military manuals suggest, which means that Karánsebes was not really unique. What made it memorable was simply the scale of the confusion and the unfortunate presence of an emperor who happened to be watching when everything went wrong. Joseph II continued the war. The campaign moved forward. Other battles happened. Real battles. Battles with real Ottoman armies and real lines of attack. And in those later battles, the Habsburg army fought much more normally. But the night near Karánsebes remained somewhere in the background, a small shadow in the memory of the campaign, a reminder that even carefully organized empires rely on fragile systems, temporary solutions, improvised arrangements, orders translated through several languages, supply wagons that may or may not arrive, rumors that may or may not be true. All of these things work together most of the time, just well enough, just reliably enough, until one evening, when fatigue is heavy and darkness arrives early, and someone fires a single unnecessary shot. History often celebrates great victories, grand strategies, heroic charges, but sometimes the most revealing moments are quieter, messier, more human. moments when nothing heroic happens at all, just confusion, just misunderstanding, just ordinary soldiers trying to survive a night that refuses to make sense. And perhaps that is why the story survived. Not because of the number of casualties, not because of the strategic consequences, but because the story feels familiar. Anyone who has ever been tired, anyone who has ever misunderstood someone in the dark, anyone who has ever watched a small problem slowly grow larger than it should, can recognize something in that strange night. An army of thousands, an emperor watching, cannons rolling through the dark, horses running, rumors spreading faster than commands. And somewhere, far from the shouting and gunfire, a quiet valley where no enemy had ever arrived. The fields around Karánsebes eventually returned to silence. Grass grew again where wagons had overturned. Villagers returned to their farms. The roads carried travelers instead of armies. And the night itself, the strange night of shouting and gunfire and shadows, slowly faded into story. But stories have a peculiar habit. They travel, they grow, they change shape slightly with every telling, until one day, people far away from those muddy fields are still hearing about it. A battle that was not quite a battle, an army that fought something invisible, and a reminder that even the grandest empires sometimes stumble over the smallest human moments